Hello, my name is Asif Din, and today I'm going to talk about how you actually plan for future change and resiliency within the design process. As with most processes, it's important to consider these early on within the design so that they can be implemented at later design stages. At stage 0, or the formulation of a brief, this is an internal process and what the design actually feels are the main risks within the design. The design analysis is then probed further in stage 2, the concept design, to test the brief through client and stakeholder input to make sure that the correct risks have been identified. It's worth going back a stage and actually trying to define what resilience is. It's the ability to bounce back and how that influences the design procedure. It needs to be based on a scenario for each design that you actually produce and trying to estimate what the projection, what changes would occur within the design based on projections and any of the problems that would result from those changes in providing appropriate solutions. But how do you actually place this within the design? Much of resilience policy is actually at a quite large city scale, so it's important to actually do this at an individual scale of what the design actually is and ask the client what their business processes are so you can interrogate how the resilience needs to manifest through the design. The main methodology in assessing the risks within a project and checking its resilience is its ability to deal with shocks, which are short-term, and stresses, which are long-term. Shocks are certain things such as flash flooding, while a stressor might be something to do with more of a long-term effect on the actual business, such as climate change. Now, each one of these risks needs to be assessed under a social, environmental, and economic frame with the frequency and the severity that these risks may incur on in terms of business operations. What is the minimum that is actually required to make sure that they can operate a viable business? And what is the awareness of the amount of risks that are actually in the vicinity? This can only actually be done through a workshop process in which beforehand the stakeholders need to be clearly identified so that they can be gauged in terms of how they understand their business operations will work in the future to a series of shocks and stresses. The key exercises within this process is the shocks and stresses and the social, environmental and economic risk matrix to allow horizon scanning to see what may change in the future, both technologically and socially, to make sure that the flexibility is built into the design project. British standards does exist on the city resilience level, but as this is a top-down process, this may take years to implement, so it has to be thought of from a bottom-up approach as well. A certain range of principles can be employed, including that there is a diversity of voices heard, so that the maximum amount of impacts can actually be assessed. This will have a scale of redundancy. There will be relationships and trends to make sure that the organisation can still function in the future. As can be seen by the diagram, the shocks and stresses influence on a range of different scales, from a very small project all the way up to city scale. From a large scale, where goals and visions are actually considered, the actual actions required at a differing scale becomes more and more concise as the scale reduces. Going from such a large scale to a small scale is a sensor check, essentially, to actually make sure that the appropriate use is being placed in the appropriate place, and to make sure that the program fits the site properly. So what does good look like? Well, you need to strengthen the actual design and make sure it's stable so that the shocks and stresses can be actually mitigated. Reduce the amount of physical risks, which is mainly to do with climatic shocks, and make sure that the project is insurable at the end of the day, providing continuous review throughout the process to make sure that all the goals are reached. The process just doesn't end at the end of the design process, but actually it starts to go as a continuous management process for the building and for the building's business operations for your client. So how's this implemented in a design practice? Well, first you have to examine what the problem actually is and then identify the risks and reduce the amount of vulnerabilities within the design project. From that, it's a process of learning to actually see how what you have placed in as mitigation actually worked, and make sure that you place those actions within new projects as you go along. It is important that you actually benchmark what you actually do. We do this internally in terms of a DEAR report at the end of each year, which stands for the Design Excellence Annual Review, in which we benchmark, measure, and make sure that the right actions have been taken at the right stage within the design. This is a quantitative measure to ensure that all aspects of resilience are actually embedded within a design project. If you have any questions or wish to get in contact, you can find me on LinkedIn. Thank you.